NFL schedules have been released. And a lot of people are going to say, oh, what's the big deal? We already knew who everyone was going to play. A schedule can make or break a season. If you start red hot but run into some trouble down the stretch, have an early season bye, you can find yourself fighting for a playoff spot or rolling into the postseason without any momentum. Likewise, if you get a right break here and there, you get a good bye, you face some teams with injuries later in the season, you can roll into the playoffs with a 5-6 game winning streak. You look at the Chiefs, relatively easy down the stretch last year, took their momentum, won a championship with it. The Bills weren't even going to make the playoffs, were floundering. Then their schedule got a lot easier towards the back half. They go on a playoff run, which ultimately ended by the Chiefs, but still, momentum is important with schedules. The strength of the schedule is important, and when you play your good opponents is really important. With that being said, we're going to get into some weak schedules and some strong schedules, some winners and losers of the schedule release, if you will.
Between some of the things you just said, there's a lot of nuances between what makes a schedule easy, what makes a schedule harder. Of course, the strength of opponents is a factor. You mentioned the Chiefs this season. They have a game on every single day of the week except Tuesday. They play on Christmas Day, which is on a Wednesday. They play on Black Friday. Of course, they have a Thursday night game. Of course, they have a Monday night game. Of course, they have a Sunday night game. I think they play... Maybe they play on a Saturday too.
They play on a Saturday. They're going head-to-head with the college football playoffs now for some reason.
They're playing on every day of the week, which makes their schedule more difficult, but they don't necessarily have the hardest schedule in the world when it comes to opponents compared to some of these other teams. And then there's elements of it. How do you start the season? Are you able to build momentum early? Do you have easier games to start your schedule? Maybe that carries you through your more difficult opponents towards the end of the season. Like Isaiah mentioned, are you able to build momentum heading into the playoffs? When does your bye week fall? How many games do you have indoors versus outdoors? When you have to go internationally, do you have a bye week immediately following? There's a bunch of different things that I think play into what makes a schedule difficult, what makes a schedule easy, and I think people's takes can vary wildly on this depending on what they value more.
Anyway, let's get right into it. Start a little bit close to home. The hardest schedule I have seen in recent memory, which for some reason has been bestowed on the third place team in their division last year. The Minnesota Vikings got absolutely screwed with their schedule. First off, they've got a brutal 10-week stretch to open the year, starting with the Giants at MetLife. You think that's an easy game? MetLife turf is undefeated. Someone's probably coming out of that game limping. After that, play San Francisco, play Houston, play Green Bay, then they have to go play in London against the Jets. Best case scenario, they come out of that with 2, maybe 3 wins, and someone's probably limping. Realistically, they're probably going to win 1, maybe 2 of those games. Go 1-4 to start the year. Then, early season bye. It's got to happen after the trip to London. I get it. Still, you don't like a week 6 bye. Then you get the Lions, Rams, Colts, and Jaguars back to back to back to back off that bye. The only saving grace of that is the Lions will have been playing the Cowboys at Jerry World the week before, and the Vikings will have been coming off a bye, so maybe they sneak that game. But still, through 10 weeks, best case scenario, you're hanging right around 500. Worst case scenario, you are 1-8, 2-7 over that stretch. And it doesn't get much better. You play the Titans, the Cardinals, the Falcons, sure, but you also play the Bears twice in the next 5 games, which if you want to play the Bears this year, you want to do it early when Caleb Williams isn't experienced, and then you close the season out with a road trip to Seattle, then playing the Lions and the Packers again. This is as hard of a schedule as I've ever seen. You would expect a reigning Super Bowl champion to get this schedule, not a team which won 7 games and it's starting Nick Mullins at quarterback.
Well, it feels with their week 1 matchup, given how they're 9 weeks after that look, it feels like the NFL was maybe trying to give them a gimme game against the New York Giants, considering the overwhelming consensus is that the Giants are going to be one of the 4 worst teams in the NFL next season. But I think even heading into week 1, that's maybe a slightly more difficult game because it's going to be Sam Darnold starting, brand new quarterback. This is what? Quarterback number 6 in just the past 2 seasons. So that is an element where he's going to have to get things going in the KOC offense. Even if it was J.J. McCarthy, you have a rookie rolling in there against the Giants. As bad as they are, they at least have continuity when it comes from the offensive play caller, and Daniel Jones will be back for what it's worth.
Yeah, slight problem. The offensive play caller hates Daniel Jones. I think Kevin O'Connell is relatively fond of Sam Darnold.
There is that there, but it makes that week 1 game just a little bit more difficult compared to if they were playing the Giants in week 9, where I don't think anyone would even doubt their ability. I think everything would be going in their favor at that point of the season.
Because the Giants have a storied history of succeeding in week 1 games.
Whatever.
40-0. Spam it in the comments again.
But then when you follow it up with the 49ers, Texans, Packers, Jets, those opponents all in a row having to go to London, and then you have your bye week. Again, with Sam Darnold at quarterback, that is not favorable. A new quarterback in a new offense, of course you have all of the weapons to get it done. When will TJ Hawkinson kind of slide in there? It's not favorable for the Vikings to be a playoff team next season.
It's not easy, but someone's got to do it. Looking over, though, at an easier schedule, you've got the Buffalo Bills. You've got the Buffalo Bills. They start off relatively easy with games against the Cardinals and the Dolphins. We know the Dolphins got rated in free agency. Their defense is going to be really questionable. The Cardinals, they're the Cardinals. Maybe they surprise you with Kyler Murray and Marvin Harrison Jr., Still skeptical about that. Their next few games, not that easy, but you look at the Jaguars, they'll be facing the Browns defense a week before playing the Bills. You look at the Ravens, they'll have just come off a trip from Jerry World. Then you look at the Texans, they'll have just played the Jaguars. So they play 3 good teams in weeks 3 to 5, but those good teams will have had a game plan for another quality opponent the week before. They're not really going to be able to build up into facing the Bills. After that, they've got a relatively easy next 5 weeks. They then play the Chiefs, which is always going to be a relatively interesting game, but they had a late season bye. They get the Rams and the Lions. Both those games are going to be indoors. They're not going to have to play outdoors in the brutal Buffalo weather. They'll be able to air the ball out. Really, in terms of schedules, the Bills got it pretty easy. They don't stack rough opponents back-to-back weeks, and they finish with the Patriots, Jets, and Patriots again.
Much like you feel about the Bills' schedule, I think a team that's in a very similar situation where they're favored in their division is the Philadelphia Eagles, because of course they have some tough opponents sprinkled in there, but in their first 4 weeks they play 3 NFC South opponents, all of which they have a better roster than. The Buccaneers, the Falcons, the Saints, they should be better than all of them. Of course, the Week 5 bye is rough. You don't want to bye that early in the season when you hopefully don't have that many players injured yet or banged up. And then you look at the rest of their schedule. They play the Cowboys in Dallas, but then they play the Commanders at home. Their last 2 games, they play the Cowboys again, but then they get to finish with the Giants. When they play their tough opponents, they have an easier matchup following the week after, and there's no 9-week stretch like the Vikings where they have to play potential playoff team after potential playoff team after potential playoff team. So I think the Eagles' schedule lines up perfectly for them to get back to the playoffs for one, and also perform in the playoffs and build some momentum heading into the playoffs.
Obviously, seeding is important if you get that first round bye or an older, more injured team. Not an indication of who the best squad in the conference really is. Chiefs just won the Super Bowl, weren't the 1 seed, didn't have the bye. But I'm kind of confident the Eagles do wind up as the 1 seed in the NFC based off this schedule. They've got a pretty easy go of it. A team which is going to have to play the Eagles and has a brutal schedule, though, is the Pittsburgh Steelers. And looking at the first half of the schedule, you think, okay, this isn't that bad. Few tough teams here and there. We've got a new quarterback, new offensive system. We'll be able to work that in. Maybe we start the season 5-3. That's optimistic. You get your bye, you play Washington. Then buckle up, because your next 8 games to end the season are the hardest stretch of football I have ever seen. Worse than even the Vikings. Baltimore, boom. Rough game in Baltimore. At Cleveland. The Browns are basically a better version of what the Steelers' offense is. Slightly more game-managing quarterback, better defense, better rushing attack. Then you play the Bengals in Cincinnati. That's going to be a rough game. Then you play the Browns again. So already, best case scenario in that stretch, you are 500 in those 2 games. Realistically, you could go 0-4. These are going to be rough physical games where you get beat up. And after getting beat up, you're going to go pay a visit to the city of brotherly love in Week 15 with the Philadelphia Eagles, followed by a trip to Baltimore. And it doesn't get any better, because Week 17, you've got the reigning Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs staring you down. Then, to close the season out, you've got the Bengals, who will probably be fighting for A, playoff spot, or B, seeded. You are not going to have an easy go of things in any of these last 8 games. Maybe you hope the Ohio-based teams get injured like they were towards the end of last season, but if you're the Steelers, that could very easily happen to you. Russ has had some injury history in the past. TJ Watt's got injury issues. That defense has injury issues. You could limp into this 8-game stretch and wind up losing 7 or maybe even all 8 of these games. If Mike Tomlin goes 500 this season, it is a true testament to his prowess as a coach. He will need to display some indomitable human spirit because this 8-game stretch to close the year is brutal.
Well, playing in the AFC North in general is brutal. When you have the Browns, Ravens, Steelers, Bengals, those 4 teams, you have to, 6 of your games are going to be against 3 of those opponents. So
yeah, but to have all 6 of those games in the final 8 weeks with your bits of respite being the Eagles and the Chiefs is just next level.
It doesn't lend itself to an easy schedule, and I don't think as highly of the Browns as you do with them being potentially the 6th best team in the AFC and a playoff team. I am not a believer in Deshaun Watson to turn his career around to a level where he's dominating the NFL again. The Steelers' schedule is tough. I think at the end of the day, probably still a 7 to 10 win team, which is what we all expect. And given Mike Tomlin's history, probably winds up with 9 or 10 wins because he does not finish below 500.
It's going to happen this year. This is the year. We've been building up to it gradually. This is going to be the season it happens.
And you mentioned the Ravens, and they don't have a horrific schedule in the totality, but when it comes to building momentum early in the season, over the first 5 weeks, it is a rough start for them. They have to go to Kansas City away, where they just lost to the Chiefs in the playoffs. They get a chance at revenge, but that's a tough matchup. Then they get to head to the Raiders, or they get to play the Raiders at home, which is not the hardest matchup in the world. But then they play Dallas, Buffalo, Cincinnati, all 3 in a row. They play 4 playoff teams in their first 5 games. That's not exactly an easy schedule to open up the season. And of course, I would probably favor the Ravens in all of those games, but if we're talking about tough scheduling and situations that may lend itself to things trending towards a negative direction if something starts to go wrong, those are some games where I'm looking at all these team schedules where for one of the top dogs in the AFC, it's not exactly in their favor.
When we talk about starting off easy and then being favored in games, you look at the 49ers, who are favored in every single game they play this year, by the way, and they got about as easy of a start as you can imagine. First off, they get a home game against the Jets. We are pretty confident here at Thicc Inc. that 49ers front 7 is going to rail the Jets offensive line. Then visit Minnesota, young quarterback, relatively inexperienced player at that position, whoever that might be. Maybe Sam Darnold knows the 49ers defense enough to pick them apart a little bit. I wouldn't be too optimistic. Then, though, they get a nice little 4-game stretch against the Rams, the Patriots, the Cardinals, and finally the Seahawks. They could very easily start their season 6-0. Worst case scenario, 4-2, but they are probably rolling into the season with some meaningful momentum. It gets a little bit harder down the stretch, but they've got a mid-season bye, and they don't finish their season particularly strong either. So it's them and the Eagles, in my opinion. The 49ers and the Eagles are going to be built around that 14 to 15 win mark. They're not going to be overly challenged by any long, tough stretches this year. And the real loser of this is the Lions, because of the 3 best teams in the NFC. They have by far the hardest schedule with how their games line up, and their 2 top opponents, their 2 competitors they'll be fighting for that 1 seed with, relatively cakewalk, relatively easy.
Well, I don't really care about how the Lions' opponents line up, because when you look at how their schedule has turned out, they have become so fortunate. They only play 3 outdoor games this season, and they just paid Jared Goff $53 million, who is an incredible quarterback when he is playing indoors. So we think they are the best team in the NFC. If you saw our last video, we both believe in the offense they have and the defense that they are building. So just given the fact that they only have 3 outdoor games, those games come a little bit later in the year. Green Bay at the beginning of November, rather than having to play that maybe in December, where it'd be even colder. They play rookie Caleb Williams in December. How's he going to perform in the cold? And then they go to the 49ers in December. Weather should be warmer for Jared Goff at that point in the year. And in some of those games, we know they have a run game to maybe control the clock and control the game late in the year. So I think the Lions schedule, just how it's lined up in that way, is very favorable, and I don't necessarily even care so much about how their opponents stack up throughout the course of the season because of the whole indoor stadium element and how good Jared Goff has been and how good I think their team is in general.
I mean, say what you want about Goff indoors, but you mentioned it, they have a great rushing attack. They do better than most teams when the weather gets cold and they can just run it down your throat with David Montgomery 25 times, then maybe do a little fancy stuff on the outside with Jahmyr Gibbs. I'd be confident about them regardless of who they're playing. As for the Caleb Williams Chicago Bears thing, that's why I didn't put them on my list for the easiest schedules. I don't think it's that hard. They've got a relatively good shake of things, but you've got a quarterback who has played at Oklahoma and then at USC for his entire collegiate career, and he is going to have to go play outside in Chicago, in Green Bay. It's going to be rough. He is not going to have an easy go of things, I think. Cold weather games affect quarterbacks vastly differently depending on where they've grown up and where they've played before. Finally, bouncing on over to the AFC one more time, I've got the Texans. You look at their first few games, they play the Colts, the Bears, the Vikings. They should start with some momentum, 3-0. They don't really string 2 or 3 hard games together at any point throughout the year. Yes, they play some good teams, but those good teams are broken up, spaced out. They're never going to have a brutal 5-game stretch where they're fighting 4 playoff teams and a division rival. It's just a balanced schedule. You see CJ Stroud, you see that new revamped defense with Daniel, you think, okay, this could compete for the AFC, this could win 12, 13 games, and the schedule lends itself to that. No strong opponents back to back to back, paired with a late season bye to let your injured players get healthy, and closing the season out, not that they'll need it, but with a game against the Tennessee Titans. That's a pretty easy schedule.
And the Texans are one of the best teams in the AFC, my second best team in the AFC, so I think they are going to thrive next year. And a schedule that has been talked about a lot, or at least I've seen a lot of major media outlets talking about it, is the New York Jets schedule. And I've seen it floated out there that the NFL hates the Jets because of all the primetime games they have lined up. They go to London to play the Vikings, then they don't have a bye week following that, and I understand that criticism of their schedule and how it does not go in their favor. And of course, they open the season on Monday Night Football versus the 49ers after the disaster that was last year. That is a lot of pressure to place on the Jets. But in another way, I think the schedule is very favorable for them because of the quarterbacks that they're playing. 6 of their first 8 quarterbacks are either inexperienced or they're Sam Darnold. In week 2, they play Will Levis, then they have Drake May, then they have Bo Nix, then it's Sam Darnold, or maybe J.J. McCarthy's in the lineup at that point of the season. Then they get to play their first game against the Bills, which is at home. Winnable primetime games against the Steelers, and they play the Patriots again in week 8. Drake May. So when you look at the first 8 weeks of the season, they have an incredible defense and they have the potential to pick on some young, inexperienced, or not so great quarterbacks outside of Brock Purdy in week 1. So I don't think the Jets schedule is as hard as some people are floating out there, and I think in many ways it favors the strength of their team, which is their defense.
I mean, the question is, can Aaron Rodgers, A, stay healthy and B, perform behind that Jets offensive line? What I'd be looking at more so than the strength of opposing quarterbacks, because the Jets defense is going to slow down anyone they play, I'd be looking at the strength of the defensive lines and front sevens the Jets are playing. That's why I'm kind of inclined to agree with the people saying, oh, the Jets are going to have a rough go of things. Some of those front sevens are going to get after Aaron Rodgers. Maybe he can succeed with the pressure in his face like he's never seen before. Who knows? But I can kind of get where the criticism of the Jets schedule and lack of belief is coming from. Finally, I want to talk about the Rams in terms of having a brutal go of things. 3 of their first 5 games are against the Lions, 49ers, and Packers. They've got an early bye. Then from week 12 to 16, they go up against the Eagles, the Saints, in New Orleans, Buffalo. They play a road game in San Francisco and close out that stretch with a road game against the Jets on that brutal MetLife turf. Old team paired with a relatively inexperienced defense. I'm not overly optimistic about what the Rams have going for them.
I have a few teams left. One team that I am not necessarily super high on just because of the whole Kirk Cousins Achilles element to it, but is the Atlanta Falcons. Their first 3 weeks, you have to open the season against the Steelers defense, which isn't exactly ideal because of how good they can be, and then you have to go to Philadelphia, and then you have to play Kansas City at home. First 3 weeks, rough. But then you look at the rest of the schedule. Every single one of those games is very winnable. They don't play a whole lot of great teams over the course of their season. So I think you look at the Falcons' schedule, and in the first year of Kirk Cousins, maybe Michael Penix is even out there, their schedule lends itself towards them winning the NFC South and towards them being a very good playoff team. So I think the scheduling is something that benefited the Falcons greatly. Heading over to the AFC.
I'm going to jump in there. The problem with that, you already hit it, 3 rough early games to start the season. If they lose all 3 of those games with Kirk Cousins, how quickly do you think Michael Penix is going to be getting chants from those Atlanta fans who already aren't accustomed to Kirk? That locker room could fall apart instantaneously with how they have drafted and how their schedule is set up. That would greatly worry me. They've got to win at least 1 and hopefully 2 of those games, or it's going to be bad.
That is definitely a piece of the puzzle, and I think when we look at the schedules and how, when we look back with 2020 vision on the season and how things played out, were you able to get off to a hot start? Were you able to correct if things didn't go that well? Did you build momentum towards the playoffs? So I think that's definitely an element to their season. And 2 schedules I still want to cover. The Titans, they did the most to support Will Levis in the offseason, or what they think is the most. They added Calvin Ridley, added Tyler Boyd, drafted CJ Latham.
JC.
But their schedule, I think it's brutal for a new head coach and second-year quarterback who struggled in week 1. You open up in Chicago against the Bears, then you play the Jets defense in week 2, Packers in week 3, Dolphins in week 4, the division rival Colts right after their bye week with a week 5 bye week, not that ideal, followed by the Bills and the Lions. So the first half of the season with a brand new head coach, post the Derrick Henry, post the Mike Vrabel era, does not lend itself to building momentum, and I think that can snowball throughout the rest of their schedule. So when it comes to Will Levis and the Titans being successful with some of the big money they spent in the offseason, the early half of their schedule with having an early bye week and some of those opponents they play, I don't think is going to pan out well.
I mean, the early bye week helps younger teams more and helps experienced older ones, which could have more injury concerns. At the end of the day, the Titans are going to come down to if Will Levis is a functional NFL quarterback or not. If he is, they've given him the pieces to succeed. They've built that offensive line the last 2 drafts. They've got him receivers. Tony Pollard's a decent running back, and they built that defense up. All on Will Levis at this point.
I have one more schedule, which is incredibly difficult, especially considering just how not great the Cardinals were last year. I mean, there's a reason their draft pick was as high as it was. They opened with the Bills, then play the Rams, then play the Lions. Then they get a little break against the Commanders. Then they have to head to San Francisco, head to Green Bay. Then they play the Rams again. Miami, those are their first 8 weeks. That is brutal for a team that has a second-year head coach. I think Kyler Murray and Marvin Harrison will be a good pairing. They have Trey McBride, who took a big step last year. They have James Conner, and they added Trey Benson in the draft. So they have some pieces across that offense where they can maybe take the next step. But when it comes to a team that was not good last year, according to their record, an absolutely brutal first 8 weeks of the season.
The key to the Cardinals is them staying healthy at their most important positions. That O-line stays healthy and Kyler stays healthy. I think they'll be all right. You're the worst team in your division last year. You play against the Rams, the 49ers, and Seahawks twice. Your schedule's never going to be that easy, but it is rather front-loaded. They can come out of that stretch with 3 wins, relatively healthy. I could see them sneaking into the playoffs.
Things are not in their favor.
It is indeed an uphill battle. Those were our incoherent thoughts on the schedule release. Obviously, a bunch of different things could go differently. Injuries, one team winds up being much worse, much better than we thought. Easier higher schedules. It's all subjective. We are just yapping here. Let us know what you think down in the comments below. If you're still here, please like, share the video. It helps the channel grow tremendously, and we'll see you next week.
Big shout out on the support on our last video, and use code Thicc on Underdog Fantasy. Doubles your first time deposit up to $200 now. Supports the channel.